I never thought that something as simple as running out of gas could turn into a nightmare, but what happened that night still haunts me. It was supposed to be a typical late night drive. I had just finished a long day at work, and all I wanted was to get home and unwind. The highway was empty. The headlights from my car cutting through the darkness, and the hum of the engine was almost like a lullaby. But then, without warning, my car started sputtering. I glanced at the gas gauge and my stomach sank. The needle was resting on empty. I cursed under my breath. How could I be so careless? I had passed a gas station about 10 miles back, but I didn't think I'd need to stop. I thought I could make it. Now, I was stranded. I pulled off the highway onto the shoulder, hoping for some kind of miracle. The area was desolate, just fields stretching out into the distance with no signs of life. It was the kind of place that seemed to swallow any sound or light. There was nothing around except the occasional flicker of a distant farmhouse far off in the distance. I checked my phone, but of course, there was no signal. No help for miles. I tried to stay calm. I figured I'd walk to the nearest exit, maybe find a payphone, or maybe even a good Samaritan who could help me. But as I stepped out of the car, I got this strange feeling. The kind of feeling that crawls up your spine and makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I looked around, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in on me. The night was still, too still. No sounds of animals or insects, just silence. As I stood there, I heard the faint sound of a car in the distance. At first, I felt relief. Maybe it was someone coming to help. But then the sound grew louder and louder, closer and closer, until it seemed like the car was almost on top of me. I froze. The headlights illuminated the dark highway, but the car didn't slow down. It didn't even swerve to avoid me. It just kept coming. My heart began to race, and I stepped back, feeling a cold sweat form on the back of my neck. The car passed right by me, its headlights flashing across my face for a split second before it disappeared into the darkness. But it wasn't like any car I had ever seen. The vehicle seemed old, like something from the 1950s. It didn't look like it belonged on a modern highway. The paint was chipped, and the tires looked worn, as though it had been abandoned years ago. I stood there, trying to catch my breath. What the hell had just happened? I felt a chill run through my body as I looked at the empty road. The car had passed me by, but it didn't seem real. It didn't make any sense. Where had it come from? And why hadn't it stopped? I decided to ignore the eerie feeling settling in my gut and walk towards the road. I had no choice but to keep moving. My car was out of commission, and I needed help. As I started walking, I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps crunching on gravel behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. There was no one there, just the empty highway, stretching out into the blackness. The footsteps continued, though, as if someone or something was following me. Every time I turned around, nothing. But when I started walking again, they'd return, and they were getting closer. My pace quickened, my thoughts racing. I kept looking behind me, convinced that someone or something was out there in the dark. It wasn't just the footsteps, though. There was a presence now, something watching me, something that wasn't human. I finally came to a turn in the road where a small, dimly lit streetlight flickered. Under it was a house, or what was left of one. It looked abandoned, old, and run down, but at least it was something. I thought that maybe, just maybe, I could find help there. I approached the front door cautiously, my hand trembling as I reached for the rusty doorknob. Before I could turn it, the door creaked open by itself, revealing a dark, empty hallway. I hesitated, but the footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. I had no choice but to go inside. The chill in the air inside the house hit me immediately, making my breath visible in front of me. It felt as if the temperature dropped 10 degrees in a second. I stepped in, closing the door behind me, and stood there, trying to adjust to the darkness. The only light came from the dim glow of the street lamp outside, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The house smelled musty, like it hadn't been lived in for years. I didn't know what I was hoping for. Someone to be there, maybe? Or maybe I was just hoping to escape whatever was following me. But the house was completely silent, save for the faint creaking of the old wood under my feet. There was no sign of life. No one. I walked down the hallway, and I could hear something else now. A faint whisper, like someone talking, but too soft to make out the words. I stopped, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but the whispers seemed to come from everywhere, echoing in my head. My mind was racing, panic rising in my chest. I turned to leave, but the door was gone. The door was gone. In its place was a wall, smooth and featureless. I frantically ran my hands over it, my fingers brushing against cold plaster. There was no way out. I was trapped. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a car engine. I turned, and for a moment I thought I saw headlights outside the window. My heart leapt in my chest. I rushed to the window, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. The headlights had disappeared. I looked back at the hallway, and that's when I saw it. A figure. It was tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes, and a face that seemed to fade in and out of existence, like a ghost trapped in time. The thing's mouth was moving, whispering words that I couldn't understand. But I didn't need to hear the words to know that I was in danger. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It felt like the very air in the house was suffocating me, holding me in place. The figure took a step closer, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. A voice echoed in my head. "You shouldn't have come here." I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't even breathe. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, like 1,000 voices all speaking at once. The figure reached out, its cold skeletal hand brushing against my face. I gasped, and that's when everything went black. The next thing I remember, I was back in my car. It was daylight. My hands were still shaking, and I could barely catch my breath. My car was in the same spot I'd left it, the gas gauge still reading empty. But the memory of what happened still lingered. The house, the figure, the footsteps that followed me. They didn't feel like just a dream. They felt real. I've never driven that stretch of highway again. And to this day, I can't explain what happened. But I know one thing for sure. There are things out there, things that live in the dark, waiting for someone like me to stumble into their world. And once you do, it's impossible to escape.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. I grew up in a small town, the kind where everyone knew each other's business, and you'd be lucky to drive for more than a few miles without passing a house or a gas station. But everything changed one night, when my car ran out of gas in the middle of nowhere. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind that makes the air feel like it's been touched by frost, even though it's still warm enough to leave the windows down. I had been driving for hours on my way back home after a long business trip. The highway was deserted, just me and the dim glow of my headlights cutting through the night. There's something eerie about being the only car on an empty road, especially when it stretches for miles and miles with no signs of civilization. I didn't think much of it at first when my gas light flickered on. I had just passed a sign saying the next town was 20 miles away, and I figured I could make it. After all, I'd driven on low fuel plenty of times before, but then the car sputtered. At first, it was just a small jolt, a hesitation of the engine. I thought maybe it was a bump in the road or a brief hiccup. But then it happened again and again. And before I knew it, the car stopped entirely. Silent. Still. The engine was dead. I cursed under my breath, glancing around. There was nothing, no sign of a gas station, no lights, just pitch black emptiness. I grabbed my phone, but there was no service. It felt like the universe had conspired to trap me here. I sighed heavily and tried restarting the car, but it wasn't going anywhere. That's when the realization hit. I was stranded, in the middle of nowhere, with no way to get help. I gathered my belongings, just a wallet, phone, and a jacket, and stepped out of the car. The night air hit me hard, cold and biting. The sound of crickets and wind was deafening in the silence, and the road stretched out ahead of me in an endless black ribbon. I didn't know which direction to walk. The town was 20 miles away, but I wasn't sure if I could even make it that far on foot. That's when I saw it. A dim light far in the distance. It wasn't the harsh yellow of a street lamp, nor the bright glow of a gas station sign. It was softer, warmer, more like a lantern's glow, flickering gently in the distance. I didn't know if it was my tired eyes playing tricks on me or if it was something more, but I knew I had no other choice. I had to head toward it. I walked for what felt like hours. Each step seemed to take me further into the unknown. The light never got any closer, though. In fact, it almost seemed to move away as I approached, like it was teasing me. My mind was playing tricks. Fears and doubts were beginning to creep in. What if it was just a mirage? What if there was no town, no gas station, nothing at all? But I couldn't stop walking. I had no other option. Eventually, the light grew brighter, and I could make out the shape of a building. A small, rundown gas station. The kind you see in old horror movies, where the paint is chipped, the windows cracked, and the whole place looks like it hasn't seen a soul in decades. The pump was ancient, rusty, and there was no sign of life. It was strange, though. Everything was quiet, too quiet. The wind stopped, the crickets fell silent, and I felt this odd pressure in the air, like something was waiting, watching. I walked up to the door of the gas station, hesitant but desperate. I knocked. No response. I knocked again, louder this time, feeling a growing unease. I pulled on the handle and the door creaked open as if welcoming me in. Inside was even stranger than I had imagined. The shelves were stocked with dusty, outdated snacks, things that looked like they'd been on the shelves for decades. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the dim light flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across the room. But there was something else. The smell. It was like a mixture of old gasoline, decay, and something sweet. Something sickly sweet, like rotting fruit. I called out, "Hello, is anyone here?" But there was no answer. The silence was suffocating, like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting. I took a step deeper into the room and glanced at the counter, where I saw an old register and a faded picture hanging on the wall. It was a photo of the gas station, taken long before it had fallen into disrepair. In the picture, a woman stood at the counter, smiling, holding a coffee cup. She looked oddly familiar, but I couldn't place her face. Her smile was too wide, almost unnatural. I moved closer, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. That's when I noticed the man. He was standing by the counter, staring at me. At first, I thought I'd imagined him, but as I blinked, I realized he was there. He was tall, gaunt, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. His skin was pale, and his clothes looked like they'd been ripped and torn in places as though he'd been out in the elements for far too long. There was something about him, something wrong, something that made my heart race. I froze, unsure whether to speak, run, or do anything at all. The man's lips twitched into a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You need gas?" he asked in a raspy voice. I nodded, too scared to speak. My throat had gone dry and I could barely breathe. The man gestured toward the pumps outside. "Out there. I can help you." I didn't want to go back outside, not with him watching me, but I knew I had no choice. I nodded again, my legs shaking beneath me as I turned to head back toward the door. The air outside was heavier now, thicker, like I was walking through molasses. The light from the gas station seemed to glow unnaturally bright, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. I made my way to the pump and the man followed me. He didn't say anything more, just stood by silently, watching as I fumbled to open the gas cap. I tried to get the pump working, but no gas came out. I glanced back at the man, but he was gone, vanished like smoke. I turned to go back inside to find him, but the building was gone too. The gas station, the lights, the man, all of it had disappeared, leaving nothing but the darkness of the road stretching out before me. I stood there, alone and frozen, as the realization sank in. I hadn't just run out of gas, I had run out of time. And whatever that place was, whatever that man was, he wasn't human. As the night pressed in, I could feel eyes watching me from every corner, from the trees lining the road, from the distant hills. The gas station had never existed. It had never been there. I turned around and started walking back to my car. My heart raced, my breath shallow. The road felt endless, like it was swallowing me whole, pulling me into a void. When I finally made it back to my car, the engine roared to life as if it had never been out of gas. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and drove away as fast as I could. The lights from the non-existent gas station slowly faded from my rearview mirror, but the terror never left me. I haven't been on that highway since. I haven't driven anywhere alone in the dark. I can't, because I know that gas station, that man, will be waiting for someone else next time. And maybe, just maybe, that someone will be you.
Next story.
It was a Saturday evening and I had just finished a long week of work. I decided to take a road trip to clear my head, just me, the open road, and my favorite music. The plan was simple: drive through some quiet back roads, enjoy the peace, and come back by nightfall. I never thought it would be my last trip along those roads. I was driving through a stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where your phone loses service, and the only company is the sound of your tires against the pavement. The sun had begun to set, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks, and I felt at ease. I had a full tank of gas, so there was no rush to stop anywhere. But then I heard the sound of a car approaching from behind. It was strange. The road was empty, and I hadn't seen another vehicle for miles. I checked my rearview mirror, but the car didn't seem to be getting closer. In fact, it was fading in and out of sight, like it was flickering in and out of reality. For a second, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but the sound of the engine remained persistent. It was louder now, almost deafening. I looked over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. A sleek black car, the kind you only see in old movies, approaching fast. It was coming too close, too fast. I tried to speed up, but the car stayed right behind me, its headlights blinding. My heart raced and my palms started sweating. There was nowhere to pull over, no shoulder to escape to. The car seemed to be pulling closer and closer, and I could feel the pressure building. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the car was gone. Just like that. I glanced back at the road behind me, and there was no sign of it. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. I shook my head, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was the stress of the week playing with my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I drove on, I started to notice something else. The gas gauge. It had been full when I started the trip, but now it was hovering dangerously close to empty. I checked the dashboard again, just to be sure. The needle was sitting just above the E. How was that even possible? I hadn't stopped anywhere. My car was practically brand new. I couldn't understand it. Panic set in. I knew there was a gas station a few miles ahead, but I wasn't sure I could make it. I had no choice but to keep driving, hoping for the best. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, with no sign of civilization in sight. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, the engine sputtered. The car lurched forward, and the sound of the engine faded into nothing. I was out of gas, in the middle of nowhere, with no one around to help. I pulled the car off the road and tried to gather myself. I didn't know what to do. I had no signal, no gas, and no idea where the nearest station was. The only thing I could think to do was walk. I got out of the car and started down the road, hoping to find some sign of life. The air had turned cold and the wind picked up, howling through the trees that lined the highway. The farther I walked, the more I felt like something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but there was this feeling, this sense of being watched, like eyes were following my every step. I walked for what felt like hours, but there was nothing. No other cars, no houses, no people. Just the endless road and the darkness creeping in. My legs ached, and I was starting to lose hope when I saw it. A light in the distance. It wasn't much, just a faint glow, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I quickened my pace, hoping that I had finally found a gas station, or at least someone who could help me. As I got closer, I saw the building. A small, rundown service station with a flickering neon sign. The place looked abandoned, like something out of a horror movie. I approached cautiously, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. The door to the station was open, but there was no one around. The station was eerily quiet, and I could hear my footsteps echoing through the stillness. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No response. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The gas pumps outside were ancient, covered in rust. It didn't look like anyone had used them in years. The shelves inside were covered in dust, and the air smelled stale, like something had been left untouched for a long time. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, like someone was calling my name. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just empty shelves and an old counter. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. I walked toward the back of the station, my heart racing in my chest. The whisper was getting closer, and I could almost hear what it was saying. "Help me." I rounded the corner, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing at the back of the station, half hidden in the shadows. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. Her mouth moved as if she was trying to speak, but no words came out. I took a step back, my stomach turning. There was something wrong with her, something wrong with this place. The woman's eyes locked onto mine, and she took a slow step toward me, her movements jerky, unnatural. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her clothes were tattered, as though they hadn't been washed in years. She reached out a hand, her fingers twisted and long as if they had been broken and reset. "Help me," she whispered again. I turned and bolted for the door, as that my legs moving faster than they ever had before. I didn't look back, but I could hear her footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, getting closer and closer. I reached the door and slammed it open, stumbling into the cold night air. But the road outside was just as empty as before. No gas pumps, no lights, no woman. I stood there, panting, my mind racing. What had I seen? What was that place? I had no answers. The road stretched out before me, dark and empty. I knew I couldn't stay there, not after what had happened. I found my way back to my car, my hands shaking as I slid into the driver's seat. I turned the key, but the engine didn't start. I tried again, but nothing. The car was dead. I don't know how long I sat there, my heart racing, my body frozen with fear, but eventually I heard it, the faint hum of an engine in the distance. I looked up, and there it was again. The same black car from earlier, its headlights glowing brightly. It came closer, faster than before, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The car didn't stop. It passed me by, the tires screeching against the pavement, but this time it didn't fade away. It didn't disappear. It kept going, down the road until it vanished into the darkness. And that's when I realized whatever had been following me, whatever had been in that station was still watching. I never got out of that stretch of road. Not again. The fear, the whispers, they still follow me even now. I never found out who or what that woman was, but I know this: sometimes the road is a place where things get lost, and some things never make it back.
Next story.
It was a late autumn evening when I found myself driving alone down an old country road. I'd been visiting family in a small town in the Midwest, far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. I should have known better, honestly. I mean, who goes on a road trip without making sure their gas tank is full? But I was running late, and after a long day of catching up with relatives, I wasn't thinking clearly. The sun had set hours ago, and the moon was barely visible behind the thickening clouds. It was one of those nights when everything felt too quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you uneasy. My gas gauge had been flirting with empty for a while now, but I told myself there would be a gas station soon. The road stretched on, empty for miles. It seemed like I was the only one left out here. That's when the first strange thing happened. I glanced at my dashboard again, and the needle on the gas gauge was all the way down to empty. Nothing new, I thought. But as I looked closer, the fuel indicator seemed to flicker, like it was trying to tell me something, or like it was struggling to show its truth. I rubbed my eyes and then looked again. It was still on empty, but the numbers around the dial were hazy, almost blurry. I shrugged it off as some weird electrical glitch. A few minutes passed, and I could see my headlights flickering in the distance. I was starting to panic. This was an isolated stretch of road. No houses, no lights, just trees and fields surrounding me. The air was getting colder, and the eerie quiet was starting to get under my skin. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, convinced someone might be following me, though I knew that was impossible. No one had passed me in miles. Just as I began to calculate how far I could get before running out of gas completely, the inevitable happened. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then it died. My heart raced as I coasted to the side of the road, my car coming to a stop. I cursed under my breath and slammed my fists on the steering wheel. There wasn't a single building in sight, not even a farm. I was completely alone. I had no cell service, and the flashlight on my phone was nearly dead. I sighed, frustrated and anxious, and made the decision to start walking. Maybe I could find a house or a barn and ask for help. I grabbed my coat and stepped out of the car, immediately feeling the cold air bite into my skin. The road was dark, pitch black with no streetlights. My footsteps seemed deafening against the stillness. I began walking forward, hoping to see something, anything, on the horizon. But nothing. Not even a faint glow from a distant porch light. It was as if I had entered some parallel world where nothing existed except for the road and the void around it. I walked for what felt like miles, but my legs grew heavier, and the cold gnawed deeper at my bones. I kept thinking I heard something behind me. a rustling, the crunch of gravel underfoot, but when I turned, there was nothing. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually I started to feel the first tinges of panic. Maybe I was hallucinating? I glanced back over my shoulder and thought I saw the faintest shadow in the distance, just off the edge of the road. At first, I tried to ignore it. It could be a trick of my eyes. But the more I walked, the clearer it became. The shadow was moving closer. I turned and started walking faster, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just a tree branch, a shadow cast by the faint light of the moon. But I knew better. The fear in my gut told me otherwise. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps far too heavy to be mine. I froze, paralyzed. It wasn't the sound of someone walking slowly, but the rhythm of someone running, fast. The footsteps grew louder. I could feel the presence closing in on me. I turned to look, but all I saw was the stretch of empty road behind me. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone, or something, was closing in from the darkness. I began to run. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted down the road, desperately looking for anything that could offer me safety. It felt like I was running for my life, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the sense that something was right behind me. The sound of those footsteps grew louder, matching my pace, never once falling behind. Just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, a flash of light broke through the darkness ahead. A car. A real car, its headlights cutting through the night like a beacon of hope. I stopped in my tracks, gasping for air, my pulse racing. But as the car drew closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The headlights were dim, like they were struggling to stay on. The car was moving slowly, almost as though it was gliding, not driving. My heart skipped a beat as it came to a stop just a few feet in front of me. I stumbled back, terror flooding my body. The door of the car creaked open, but no one stepped out. Instead, a figure, dark and indistinct, emerged from the driver's seat. The figure was tall, thin, with a hood covering its face. I couldn't see its features, but I could feel its presence, oppressive and wrong. "Do you need help?" the figure asked, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. It was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, just empty. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My mouth was dry, and all I could do was nod, too terrified to speak. The figure stepped aside, gesturing toward the car. "Get in. I'll take you where you need to go." I didn't hesitate. I ran to the car, opened the door, and slid into the passenger seat, hoping beyond hope that this would be the end of my nightmare. The engine started with an unsettling growl, and the car began moving again. We drove in silence. The road stretched on, but it felt like the car was moving slower and slower, as if the wheels were struggling against some invisible force. The landscape outside the window was changing, but it wasn't right. The trees appeared more twisted, the shadows longer, and I could swear I saw figures lurking just beyond the tree line. Figures that didn't belong. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but I couldn't speak. Every time I tried to glance over at the driver, I saw nothing but darkness under the hood. I tried to reach for my phone to call for help, but it was dead. I had no way of knowing where I was or how far from safety I had gone. Eventually, we came to a stop. The car idled in front of an old, decrepit gas station. I had never seen it before, and I certainly didn't recognize the sign above the station. The gas pumps were covered in dust, their handles hanging limp as if they hadn't been used in decades. The entire place felt abandoned, and yet, something about it felt like it was waiting for me. The figure in the driver's seat turned toward me, its face still obscured by the hood. "This is where you get off." I opened my mouth to protest, but before I could say anything, the door to the car swung open. The figure pointed toward the gas station with a long, bony finger. "Get out." I stumbled out of the car, my legs unsteady. As soon as my feet hit the ground, the car sped off, disappearing into the night. I watched it vanish into the darkness, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned toward the gas station, my mind screaming for me to leave, to run back to the road. But something kept me there. Something invisible and powerful. It wasn't until I took a step forward that I realized there were people inside. Shadowy figures, standing still and watching me through the grimy windows. Their faces were pale, hollow, eyes empty. They never blinked. They never moved. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran, blindly heading back down the road, away from the station, from whatever nightmare had just unfolded. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I felt like I might collapse at any moment. I don't know how long I ran or where I ended up, but I was eventually found, hours later, by a passing trucker who helped me to the nearest town. They said there was no gas station for miles around, but I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I'll never drive that road again.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts. I was the kind of person who scoffed at the idea of haunted houses, eerie spirits, and unexplained phenomena. Rational thought had always been my guiding principle. But that night, the night I ran out of gas on an old isolated stretch of highway, something happened that changed my mind forever. It was late, probably around midnight, when I found myself on the road. I had just left a family reunion, and the drive home was supposed to be straightforward. But as the miles passed, I started realizing something. I hadn't stopped for gas in a while. My car was a few years old, and the gas gauge was showing dangerously close to empty. I glanced at the horizon, but there was nothing. Just endless darkness. I'd seen a sign for a gas station a few miles back, but it felt like ages ago. My stomach churned as I checked the gauge again. It was almost on E, and I was starting to get nervous. I should have known better than to push my luck, but I kept telling myself I'd make it. And yet, the car had other plans. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then died. I was stranded. I pulled the car to the side of the road, threw the hazards on, and sat for a moment. The silence outside was almost oppressive. There were no other cars on the road, no lights, not even the distant glow of civilization, just the occasional rustle of trees swaying in the wind. I grabbed my phone and saw no bars. Of course. Why would I be able to call for help? I stepped out of the car and stretched my legs, feeling a chill in the air. I didn't know what to do. There were no houses around, no lights on the horizon. The thought of walking down the road and hoping for a passing car seemed ridiculous. But what else could I do? After a deep breath, I decided to start walking. Maybe I'd find a gas station, or at least some kind of landmark. I had no other choice. The air grew colder as I trudged down the road. My shoes crunched against the gravel, the only sound breaking the overwhelming silence. I thought I saw something moving in the shadows, but when I looked, there was nothing. The road stretched on, empty and desolate. I kept walking, hoping I wasn't going too far from my car. But then something strange happened. I glanced behind me, and I thought I saw a faint light in the distance. I froze. Could it be a car? I started walking faster, hoping it was someone who could help. The light grew closer, and soon I saw it clearly. Headlights. But these weren't normal headlights. They seemed too bright, too unsettling. As the car drew closer, I could see that it wasn't moving like any car I'd ever seen. It glided along the road, silently, almost as if it wasn't even touching the ground. The headlights were so bright that they hurt my eyes, but they didn't cast any light on the surroundings. There was no shadow, no reflection in the puddles on the road. The car came to a stop a few feet in front of me. The engine was silent, as though it had no engine at all. I stood there, unsure of what to do, my heart pounding in my chest. The door opened with an unsettling creak. A figure stepped out. It was tall, shrouded in a dark cloak, with a hood that covered its face. The air grew even colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Do you need help?" the figure asked, its voice soft and distant. It was neither a man's voice nor a woman's. It was a voice that didn't belong in this world. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. Something in me told me I needed to answer. "Yeah, I'm out of gas," I managed to say, my voice shaky. "Can you help me? I'm stranded." The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my words. It just stood there, still, as if waiting for something. I tried to take a step closer, but my legs felt heavy, like I was walking through mud. My breath became shallow, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The figure reached into its cloak and pulled out a small, glowing object. It looked like a lantern, but it wasn't like any lantern I'd ever seen. It didn't cast any light, but the glow seemed to pulse, faint and cold. The figure raised it, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in its face. The faintest outline of eyes, but not human eyes. Dark, empty pits that seemed to stare right through me. "You've made a mistake," the figure whispered. "You shouldn't be here." Before I could respond, a gust of wind blew through the trees, and the light of the lantern flickered. My surroundings seemed to distort like a fog was rolling in. The road, the trees, everything around me began to twist, to bend in unnatural ways. I couldn't focus. The car, the figure, everything was blurring together. My heart raced, and my breath came in short, panicked gasps, and then it was gone. I was standing in the middle of the road, alone, no car, no figure, just the darkness and the sound of the wind. My legs gave out beneath me, and I fell to my knees, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I don't know how long I sat there, my mind reeling from what had just happened. When I finally stood up, I turned around, half expecting to see the mysterious car behind me, but there was nothing. The road was empty again. I stumbled back to my car, feeling a strange pull in my chest. Something wasn't right. I got in, sat behind the wheel, and tried to start the engine. The car roared to life as if nothing had ever happened. I took a deep breath and looked around. The road seemed normal again, like it had before. But I knew it wasn't. Something had changed. I wasn't sure what had happened or what I had encountered, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been on the brink of something far worse. I drove home that night, every passing mile feeling heavier than the last. The shadows along the road seemed to grow longer, and the air grew colder. When I finally reached my house, I parked the car and stared out the window, half expecting to see the glowing headlights in my rearview mirror. But nothing. That night, I locked all the doors, checked every window, and sat awake, staring into the dark. I still couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I had encountered something that wasn't human, something that shouldn't exist. I never drive down that highway again. And if you ever find yourself stranded on a lonely road in the middle of nowhere, remember, some lights are meant to lead you to safety, and others, they'll take you somewhere you'll never come back from.
Next story.
It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when I found myself stuck in the middle of nowhere, my car sputtering to a stop as the gas tank hit empty. It wasn't the first time I'd found myself running low on fuel, but something about this situation felt different. The vast, empty stretch of road ahead of me seemed to stretch on forever, with no signs of civilization in sight. I had just passed the last small town about 30 miles back, and there was nothing for miles ahead. No phone signal, no cars, just me, the road, and the deepening silence. I tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't budge. The gas light had been on for a while, but I was certain I could make it. I had made it on empty before, so why should tonight be any different? But now, with no options left, the reality of my situation sank in. I was stranded. I looked around, hoping for some sort of sign. That's when I saw it, off in the distance, just barely visible through the thick mist that had started to roll in. A small, run-down service station sat on the side of the road. I couldn't believe my eyes. It had to be some sort of mirage, right? But no, the dim lights flickered against the encroaching fog, and I knew that it was real. The only thing in sight for miles. I grabbed my jacket, locked the car, and began walking toward it, hoping that I could at least get a gallon of gas and make my way home. The station looked like it had been abandoned for years. The paint was chipped, the roof sagged in places, and the old gas pumps were coated in rust. But there was a flickering neon sign that read "Open" in bold, faded letters, and it seemed like my only chance. As I approached, the front door creaked open as though it had been waiting for me. Inside, the air was thick and musty, like something long forgotten. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sickly glow on the dusty shelves. There were cans of food that looked decades old, and jars of pickles that had turned a sickly yellow. The place seemed untouched by time, as if no one had been in for years. I stepped further inside, and a bell above the door rang softly, but no one appeared. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice echoed back, but there was no response. I waited for a moment, and then I heard a shuffle from the back of the store. The sound of slow footsteps made my heart race. A man emerged from the shadows wearing a dirty mechanic's jumpsuit. His hair was unkempt, and his face was covered in a layer of grime. He looked at me with eyes that seemed almost hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days, or maybe longer. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. I ran out of gas," I said, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "I saw your station and thought maybe you could help me out?" The man nodded slowly, as though this was something he had done 1,000 times before. "Of course," he said, turning and motioning toward the back. "Follow me." I followed him through the narrow aisles, past shelves covered in dust and cobwebs. The deeper into the store we went, the colder it seemed to get. I could feel the temperature drop with each step, and a chill ran down my spine. He led me to a small room at the back of the building. There was a counter, an old cash register, and a single pump in the corner. He gestured toward it. "That'll do it," he said, his voice distant. I glanced at the pump. It looked ancient, its metal surface rusted and chipped. But it was a pump, and it was all I had. "Thanks," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The man didn't say anything as I walked toward the pump. I tried to pull the nozzle, but it was stuck. I tugged on it, but it wouldn't budge. The man stood in the doorway of the room, watching me silently. I felt uneasy, but I didn't want to seem too scared. This was just a gas station, right? There was nothing to be afraid of. I tried once more to pull the nozzle, and this time it came free with a loud, grating noise. But as I turned the nozzle toward my car, the man stepped forward and placed his hand on my shoulder. "Careful," he warned, his voice low and grave. "You don't want to do that." I turned to him, confused. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned and walked back into the store. The door creaked shut behind him. I stood there holding the nozzle, unsure of what to do. I had no other choice but to fill up. It was the only way I was going to get home. But as I began to squeeze the handle, something strange happened. The gas didn't come out as expected. Instead, a thick, dark liquid began to pour from the nozzle, splashing on the ground. It didn't smell like gasoline. It had a rancid odor, like something long dead. I jumped back, startled. The liquid spread across the pavement, and I felt my stomach churn. Something wasn't right. I dropped the nozzle and ran back toward the store, but the man was nowhere to be found. The shelves were empty now, the aisles eerily silent. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was trapped. I felt my breath catch in my chest as I turned, seeing the man standing at the far end of the store, his eyes now glowing an unnatural shade of red. His mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, his voice low and cold. "You were never meant to leave." I ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. The windows were blocked by shadows, and the walls seemed to close in on me. The store had become a maze, and I could feel something watching me from the darkness. I stumbled toward the back door, but before I could reach it, the man was there, his hand outstretched, his grip icy cold as he caught my wrist. "You can't leave," he repeated, his voice rising in a low, guttural growl. I struggled against his grip, but his strength was unnatural. My heart pounded as I felt a growing sense of hopelessness wash over me. The darkness was all around me now, swallowing the light, the air, and my every breath. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my car. The gas light was still on, and I was still in the same spot on the road, but the gas station was gone. The fog had lifted, and the world was silent, as though nothing had ever happened. I looked around, trying to make sense of it, but there was nothing. No sign of the station, no man, no shadows. I drove away as fast as I could, my heart racing and my mind spinning. I never found that gas station again, and I never ran out of gas again either. But I still feel it sometimes, that presence, that cold, unexplainable feeling. I can still hear that man's voice whispering from the darkness, and I wonder if the road is watching me, waiting for the next person to drive by. And next time, it might be you.
Next story.
It started like any other evening. I was driving back home after a long day at work, the sun dipping below the horizon as twilight settled in. The road stretched out before me, familiar and comforting in its solitude. But tonight, there was something in there, something off, but I couldn't quite place it. I had been driving for hours through the back roads, avoiding the highway for a change. It was a clear evening, and I enjoyed the calmness of the open country roads. It was just me, the road, and the hum of the tires on the pavement. The sound was soothing, like a lullaby that kept me grounded in the present. I wasn't in a hurry, no real destination other than home, just a quiet drive. That was until the gaslight flickered on. It wasn't an emergency yet, but I had about 30 miles left before my fuel would run dry. The next town was still a good distance away. I looked at the map on my phone, but of course there was no signal. Just my luck. It seemed like I hadn't seen a gas station for miles. I'd passed a couple earlier, but I was so focused on the quiet drive that I hadn't stopped. The road ahead was empty, the darkness now swallowing up the landscape, and the faint orange glow of my headlights was the only thing breaking through the night. I kept my eyes peeled, hoping to see something, anything, that would signal a gas station. But the minutes passed, and the road stayed barren. I glanced at the fuel gauge again. The needle was dangerously close to empty. A few miles later, I rounded a curve and saw a flicker of light in the distance. A gas station. My heart lifted at the sight. It was small and looked a little rundown, but it was exactly what I needed. I made a quick decision and turned onto the gravel driveway that led to the station. I pulled into the lot, relieved. The station was old, but still functional. The flickering lights from the sign above spelled out "Open" in dusty neon letters. There was an eerie stillness to the place, though. No cars around, no sounds, except for the faint buzz of the sign and the wind whispering through the trees. But I didn't think much of it. I was just happy to find a place to refuel. I got out of the car and walked toward the pump. As I approached, I noticed how run down the place really was. The pumps were rusted and the concrete around them cracked and uneven. The place looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. Still, there was fuel, and that was all that mattered. I grabbed the nozzle and was about to start pumping when I heard a voice. Soft, but clear. "Can I help you?" I froze, dropping the nozzle in surprise. The voice came from behind me. I turned quickly to see a man standing in the doorway of the small station, staring at me with a blank expression. He was tall, his face gaunt and pale, and his eyes were strange. Too dark, too intense. His clothes were dirty and his hair was unkempt, as if he hadn't cared for it in weeks. He gave me a slow, almost imperceptible smile, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to shake off the unease and forced a smile. Yeah, I ran out of gas," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just need to fill up." He nodded and took a step closer, still watching me with those unnerving eyes. "Of course. Just a moment," he said in a voice that sounded much too calm for the situation. He turned and disappeared into the station, leaving me standing there alone. I hesitated for a moment, feeling a chill run down my spine, but then I shook it off. This was a gas station in the middle of nowhere. People worked here. I couldn't let my imagination get the best of me. The man returned a minute later, holding a metal canister in his hands. He approached the pump and set the canister down carefully, giving me another odd smile. "I don't have a lot of fuel, but this should get you to the next town," he said. "It's all I've got." I frowned. "I'm not sure that's enough." "I'm pretty low." He simply nodded and gestured toward the canister. "It will be enough. Trust me." His calmness was unsettling, but I was desperate. I needed to get home, and this was my only chance. I agreed, and he began to pour the fuel into my tank. The metal canister clinked with each drop as he filled it. As he worked, I noticed something strange. The air felt colder, the shadows seemed darker, and the sounds around me grew muted, like the world was slowing down. I shook my head, telling myself I was just tired from the drive. I hadn't slept much the past few nights, and it was probably getting to me. Finally, the man finished pouring the fuel and stood back, giving me another strange, hollow smile. "That should do it," he said. "Thanks," I replied, reaching for my wallet. I figured I should pay him for the fuel, but when I looked up to offer money, I realized something even stranger. The man wasn't there anymore. The station was empty. The door that he had just come through was wide open, but the interior of the station was dark, completely dark, as though it hadn't been used in years. There was no sign of the man, no trace of him anywhere. I glanced around, my heart now racing. This didn't make sense. I had just spoken to him. He had poured the gas into my car, yet there was no one around, no sound, no movement. I quickly jumped into my car and slammed the door shut, the engine roaring to life with a violent sputter. I didn't look back as I sped off, my eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. I didn't care about the strange station anymore. I just needed to get out of there. As I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror. The gas station was gone. There was nothing but empty road behind me. I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart thumping in my chest. I tried to calm my breathing and check my phone for a signal, but there was still no service. It wasn't until I pulled into the next town and found a gas station that I had the courage to look at my tank. It was full. I hadn't asked for that much fuel. The canister the man had used was small, far too small to fill my tank completely. Yet, when I checked, the needle was sitting on full. I still don't know what happened that night. I never found that gas station again, even though I've driven those roads several times since. I've asked around, but no one seems to know of it. It's like it doesn't exist. All I know is that something didn't want me to leave that night, and somehow, I think it's still watching.
Next story.
I had never believed in ghost stories or in anything supernatural for that matter. I was the type of person who scoffed at the idea of things that go bump in the night. So when I found myself in the middle of a remote, unfamiliar stretch of road late one evening, I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. I was just out on another solo trip, one of those spur-of-the-moment decisions to break free from the grind of daily life. It was late autumn, and the night had come quickly. The sun had dipped below the horizon long ago, and the moon was barely visible through the haze of clouds. My car, a beat-up sedan I had recently bought from a friend, hummed steadily on the road as I traveled through the wilderness. I had taken a detour to avoid the main highway, thinking I could find a more peaceful path to my destination. The road had become increasingly narrow, winding through thick woods, with no lights except for my headlights cutting through the darkness. It was the kind of place you'd expect a horror movie to start. Everything was fine, though. That is, until I noticed the gas gauge. I'd been driving for hours, and the low fuel light hadn't come on yet. I thought I still had enough to make it to the nearest town, but when I glanced at the dashboard, my heart sank. The gas gauge was showing empty. Panic crept into my mind. I hadn't passed a gas station in miles, and my phone had no signal. I hadn't thought to bring a gas can with me, and I wasn't sure how far away I was from anything. I pulled over to the side of the road, my headlights illuminating a thick, endless wall of trees on either side of me. I sighed and cursed myself for being so careless. My only option was to walk until I found something. I checked the map on my phone, but it was useless. No bars. I decided to set out, hoping to find a house or another car that could help. I had walked for what seemed like miles, but nothing appeared, no signs of life, just the endless road and the rustling of leaves in the wind. As the temperature began to drop, I started to regret my decision. The silence around me was oppressive, and every time a branch cracked underfoot, my nerves jumped. But still, I pressed on. It wasn't until I saw something in the distance that I felt a flicker of hope. A light, a faint glow, shining through the trees. It wasn't much, but it was something. I quickened my pace, and as I drew closer, I realized it was a house. A small, rundown cabin sitting by the side of the road. The porch light was flickering, but it was enough to guide me toward it. I approached cautiously, noticing how still everything seemed. No cars in the driveway, no sounds coming from inside. But the door was slightly ajar, so I pushed it open. The interior was dim, with only the glow of a single lamp providing any illumination. Dust covered the furniture, and there was an old musty smell in the air like the place had been abandoned for years. I called out, but there was no answer. "Hello," I said, my voice sounding small in the empty space. Nothing. I stepped further inside, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. There was an old rocking chair by the window, swaying gently as if someone had just left. The room had an eerie, unnerving quality to it. As I walked deeper into the house, I noticed something strange. There were pictures on the walls, but the faces in the photos were blurred as if someone had intentionally smudged the images. I felt a chill run down my spine, and just as I was about to leave, I heard a faint sound, a whisper. It was so soft that I almost thought I imagined it. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. A voice, a low, guttural murmur, calling my name. I froze. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my instincts told me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The whispering continued, and I could make out a few words now. "Come closer. I'm waiting." I tried to gather my composure and step back toward the door, but before I could reach it, the door slammed shut with a violent crash. The room seemed to darken, the flickering lamp casting strange shadows on the walls. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned, frantic, looking for an escape. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a reflection in the window, but no, she was standing there, just a few feet away. A woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow, staring at me with a haunting intensity. Her mouth was moving, but no sound came from it. Her clothes were old-fashioned, tattered as if they hadn't been touched in years. I backed away slowly, my heart racing, my head spinning. My mind screamed at me to get out of there, but my feet were frozen. The woman began to step forward, her movements jerky, unnatural. With each step, the air grew colder, the temperature plummeting. "Leave before it's too late," she whispered, her voice now clear, though raspy, like it had been dragged through years of decay. Suddenly, the walls around me seemed to close in, the room growing smaller, darker. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, by this thing that was no longer human. Its eyes locked on mine, as if it were feeding off my terror. The air grew thick, suffocating. My vision blurred, and I could feel a pull, something invisible, trying to drag me toward her. My head throbbed as if it were being crushed by an unseen weight. I stumbled backward, desperate to break free, and that's when I saw it, a dark, shadowy figure in the corner, standing by the window. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its eyes were glowing, yellow, predatory. I didn't hesitate. With everything I had left, I lunged for the door, my body moving on pure instinct. I smashed into it with my shoulder, the wood splintering beneath the force. I tumbled out into the cold night, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran down the road, not caring which direction I was heading, just desperate to escape. My chest burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. Not until I finally reached my car, still where I had left it, its engine cold and silent. I climbed into the driver's seat, shaking so badly that I could barely start the car. The engine roared to life, and I sped off, my hands gripping the wheel like a lifeline. I don't know what I saw in that house, or who, or what was waiting for me. But I know this. I never went back to that stretch of road, and I never planned to. Whatever it wasn't done with me. And I knew that, deep down, I would never feel safe again.
Next story.
I remember it like it was yesterday. The night I found myself stranded in the middle of nowhere with no gas, no phone service, and something far worse than loneliness creeping through the air. It was late, somewhere after midnight, as I made my way through the desolate stretch of highway. I was heading home from a visit to my parents' house, feeling tired and ready to get some rest. The road was empty, just the occasional street lamp flickering like a ghost on the horizon. The air outside was thick with the smell of rain, though the sky hadn't yet opened up. My car had been running fine, and I wasn't concerned about anything until the dreaded sound of the gas needle dipping into the red zone reached my ears. I'd passed the last town about 20 miles ago, and I hadn't seen any signs for gas stations. I figured I could make it to the next one. It wasn't like I'd never driven on low fuel before, right? But that's when my car began to sputter. I tried to coax the engine back to life, but the coughing noises only got worse. With a heavy sigh, I pulled over onto the shoulder of the highway. The empty, endless stretch of road around me was overwhelming. I knew I was in a bad spot. No service, no cars, nothing. I glanced around, no sign of life, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant hum of the highway behind me. Then a glimmer of light appeared in the distance. I squinted, wondering if it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But no, it was a faint yellowish glow, just a flicker like a candle. I grabbed my jacket, locked the car, and stepped out onto the cold pavement. The wind whipped around me, sending a chill down my spine, but it was the light that pulled me in, beckoning me like a moth to a flame. I began walking down the road toward it, and as I got closer, I saw what it was, an old, dilapidated gas station, its single light hanging from a rusted pole. The kind of place you only see in old horror movies, the kind you'd never want to stop at. Yet in my desperation, it was the only option. As I approached, I noticed the gas pump was ancient. The glass was cracked, the buttons worn down from years of neglect. The entire place was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, and I felt this strange unease crawling up my spine. Something didn't sit right about it. But I had no choice. I needed gas, and I wasn't about to walk another 20 miles. I pushed open the door, and the creaking noise echoed in the silence. Inside was even worse. The shelves were lined with old, expired snacks, some with yellowing labels. The air smelled stale and damp, like no one had been here in decades. "Hello?" I called out. My voice bounced off the walls but didn't seem to reach anywhere. There was no answer. I moved further into the store, walking toward the counter where a dusty register sat. Behind the counter was a strange old woman, her hair wild, her eyes dark and hollow. She stared at me, unmoving. For a moment, I thought I had imagined her, but no, there she was, just staring, unblinking, as if waiting for me to say something. I was taken aback by the intensity of her gaze. It was like she could see right through me. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice low and rasping as though she hadn't spoken in years. I ran out of gas. I just need to fill up, I said, my voice shaky. Her presence unsettled me, but I was more desperate for gas than I was for company. She nodded slowly, and with a faint, almost imperceptible smile, she motioned for me to go outside. "The pump will work, but be careful. It's the last one." I didn't question her. I just nodded and walked back out to the pump, my footsteps heavy with the weight of something I couldn't place. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right, something beyond just the desolate station or the strange woman. I twisted the nozzle, but when I pressed it to fill the tank, nothing happened. No gas came out. I stared at the pump, confused. "Need some help with that?" The woman's voice cut through the silence behind me. I turned around, and there she was again, standing at the door with that same unsettling smile on her face. There was something about her, something off, that made my stomach churn. It's not working," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. "The pump's broken." She didn't respond. She just walked toward me, her feet making no sound on the gravel. I stepped back, feeling an inexplicable fear tightening in my chest. Suddenly, her smile faltered. She raised one bony finger and pointed to the dark woods beside the station. "You need to go. It's not safe to stay here." A cold shiver ran through me. I didn't know why, but the thought of staying any longer filled me with dread. I quickly turned back to the pump and tried once more, but it was still dead. I cursed under my breath. Without a word, I turned and ran back to my car, almost tripping over my feet in my panic. As I fumbled for my keys, I heard a noise, faint, like a whisper. I turned around, but the gas station was gone, completely vanished. The light, the building, everything, gone, as if it had never been there in the first place. My heart raced. I rubbed my eyes in disbelief. I quickly hopped into the car and slammed the door shut. The engine sputtered, and for a moment, I thought it was going to fail me too. But it started, and I hit the gas, speeding down the road as fast as I could. I couldn't look back. I didn't want to know if that station was still there, waiting for someone else. As I drove away, I finally realized what the woman had meant. It wasn't just the gas station that wasn't safe. It was everything around it. I was trapped in some twisted loop, a place that didn't belong in the world, a place that should have been forgotten long ago. I never told anyone about that night. Who would believe me, right? It's one of those things you just want to forget. But the truth is, I still get this feeling sometimes, like I'm being followed, like something's waiting. And I can't shake the feeling that I'll be back there again someday. And when I do, I hope I'll be ready.
Next story.
I was always one of those people who preferred driving through the back roads. The highways were too fast, too noisy. But the country roads, their quiet simplicity, the stillness of the world around me, had always been comforting. I liked the slow pace. It gave me time to think, time to clear my head. But this time, as I drove through the isolated stretch of road that seemed to go on forever, something felt different. The air was thicker, the night darker. It wasn't the kind of night that invited peaceful thoughts. It was the kind of night that whispered secrets. I was on my way to a friend's house, heading down an unfamiliar stretch of highway. The road was curvy and winding, lined with trees that seemed to close in around me. The soft hum of my car's engine was the only sound, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I brushed it off at first. Just nerves, I told myself. Just the isolation of the place. That was when I saw it. A small, flickering light in the distance. It was the kind of light you wouldn't think twice about in a city. But here, on this empty stretch of road, it looked out of place. I slowed down, squinting into the darkness to make sure I wasn't imagining it. As I got closer, I realized it was a gas station, barely visible in the fog that seemed to have rolled in out of nowhere. I hadn't seen a gas station in miles, and my fuel gauge was inching closer to empty. It seemed like a good idea to stop and fill up, though I couldn't shake the strange feeling in my gut as I approached the place. The station was small, one of those old-timey, out-of-the-way places you see in movies. Neon signs that flickered like they hadn't been maintained in years, a rusty pump that looked like it had been sitting there for decades. The light from the station barely lit the area, casting long, eerie shadows around the empty lot. No cars, no people, just the unsettling hum of that flickering neon sign. I parked my car, and as soon as I stepped out, a cold gust of wind hit me, sending a shiver down my spine. The air felt unnaturally cold for a warm summer night. There was something about the place that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I walked to the pump, unsure of what to expect. That's when I noticed the door to the station slowly creak open, as if someone had been waiting for me. A tall man, his features obscured by the shadows, stepped out. He wore a mechanic's jumpsuit, his face gaunt and pale, eyes wide and unblinking. "You need gas," he asked in a voice that was raspy, almost like he hadn't spoken in days. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of why I felt so unsettled by his presence, but I needed gas, and I wasn't about to turn around now. "Yeah, I'm running low. I'll take a fill-up," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The man nodded slowly, still staring at me with that strange, piercing gaze. He didn't say another word, just walked to the pump and began filling my car. I stood there, awkwardly shifting from one foot to the other. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made my thoughts feel too loud. As the man pumped the gas, I noticed something strange. The station was old, but it wasn't just old. It was ancient. The building itself looked as though it had been abandoned for decades, its paint peeling off the walls, the windows cracked. But what really caught my attention were the items on the shelves inside. There were dusty cans of food, old newspapers, and even books. But they were all dated, decades-old dates, as though this station had been frozen in time. "Does anyone else come through here?" I asked, trying to make conversation, though I had a feeling I already knew the answer. The man didn't look up from the pump as he replied, "Not many people stop by. They don't usually need to. Not anymore." I was about to ask him what he meant when something caught my eye from the corner of the station. I couldn't quite make it out, but it looked like movement, like someone or something was watching me from the dark corner of the building. I turned quickly, but the corner was empty. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice a little more strained than I intended. The man didn't respond right away, but I saw his eyes flicker toward the dark corner too. For a brief moment, his expression changed. His face grew darker, more serious. "You should leave," he said quietly, as if he were warning me, not offering a suggestion. "It's not safe to stay." I looked back at my car. The fuel gauge was nearly full, and I felt a strange urgency to leave. But I didn't understand why. I wasn't scared of the man, at least not in the way that made sense. There was something else, something unnatural about the station, the man, the place. I turned to pay him, but he wasn't at the pump anymore. He had disappeared back inside the station. My heart raced as I quickly walked back to my car, my instincts screaming at me to get away. I threw open the door, started the engine, and drove off before I could second-guess myself. The road ahead seemed endless, but I didn't care. I had to get away. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The station was gone, completely gone. The neon lights, the rusted pumps, the empty lot, it had vanished as if it had never been there. The road behind me was empty, as it should have been all along. I told myself it was a trick of the mind, some illusion caused by exhaustion or stress, but something inside me knew that wasn't the case. I didn't know what that place was or who the man was, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never drive down that stretch of road again. And as I drove into the night, I couldn't help but feel that the road itself was watching me.